This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. The Fantasia Film Festival ran from July 18th to August 4th, and we are recapping some of the films that we saw during the Montreal Fest that celebrates the best in sci-fi, horror, and genre films. This is our fourth year providing coverage. Joining me today is Jeff Bulmer, one half of the Classic Movies Live podcast, who was last heard on episode 281, the 2024 Toronto Japanese Film Festival. Welcome back to the show, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but for people who are in Toronto, I do want to point out that the last time I was here, you just said was for the Toronto Japanese Film Festival. The Japanese Canadian Cultural Center is like going through some stuff right now. I think they may not. It's possible they may not be around for very much longer, and that would not be good. So if you are around Toronto, please read up on that and support them if you can.
Wow, I did not know that. That's really sad and would be a really big loss to, I think, the community, both for the Japanese Canadian community and for the wider outreach as far as providing cultural significance to the city of Toronto and the country of Canada, because they do a lot of great work there.
Yeah, and even like going very specifically into film, I remember on that last episode, I was talking about a lot of the movies that I was able to see there. You know, a few of them were from 2022 and just would not otherwise get a release over here. And, I just might not be able to see them. And through being able to put eyeballs on films like that, we actually have a lens into what Japanese filmmaking is like right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that we can't see other Japanese filmmakers, but it's nice to see some of the ones that aren't the big names coming out of Japan. And so I think it's I really hope that my information on that front is incomplete, so I hope that I am being a little more dramatic than is warranted, but I really hope that I really hope that next year I can be at the Toronto Japanese Film Festival again at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center.
Yeah, well, make sure to keep us posted, because if there is anything either myself or listeners can do, please make sure to share that, and we'll try to amplify that.
Absolutely, I will. I should have looked that up before this. I will look it up immediately when we're done. When we're done with this recording.
Yeah, but you're back helping to cover another film festival, and I can't remember, is this the first time that you've covered Fantasia, or have you covered it in the past?
This is the first time I've covered Fantasia. I've really wanted to cover Fantasia in the past, but I've never had the opportunity. I've actually never really had the platform before, because I think I was writing reviews for you close to a year ago. But I think my first festival coverage with you was TIFF last year, which is pretty much the next big one after Fantasia. So I must have just missed the boat on this one.
Yeah, well, this is a festival that I feel is very near and dear to my heart. One, they've always been very gracious, much like Toronto Japanese Film Festival, in allowing me access to their screeners and things like that. What are your thoughts of the festival as a first year sort of quasi attendee, as a virtual attendee?
This was really great. I guess as a virtual attendee, you don't get to see as many movies as I would like to at any given festival, which makes sense. But I was, looking back, while there's a few big ones that were playing at Fantasia that I wasn't able to see, that I was really excited for, I was very impressed with the amount of stuff they did have virtually and that I was able to see there. I think I saw under 10 movies, but there were probably about 10 that I was really, really eager to see, and I saw most of them. I would say probably the biggest one that I was very bummed to not be able to see was Frankie Frico, which I actually am in contact with the PR person for that. So I will probably be able to see that, or at least I will know when it's coming to Toronto, because that one looks really good. That one's one I'm excited for.
Yeah, they always have such an interesting and unique lineup of titles that, for the most part, you never really hear that much about. One, they do specialize in bringing a lot of international cinema to Canada, especially from Asia. But you also get a lot of like Eastern European countries that we don't normally see a lot of movies from. So it's sort of interesting going through the program where you know what the genres that the festival specializes in, sci-fi, thriller, horror, sort of the big ones. And you're trying to read these like one sentence synopsis to figure out what interests you, what's going to pique your attention out of like 100+ movies. And you're like, okay, this sentence sort of sounds interesting, but like what genre is it going to be? You're trying to guess which one it's going to sort of play in a little bit there. And so it's a bit of a guessing game as far as what you're going to get, because you never really truly know until you start watching these movies.
Hmm. And I think they have like a pretty broad. I was really impressed with sort of the range of filmmaking on display too, because I saw two movies here. Well, one of them I peeked into. I didn't have the chance to actually watch the whole thing. I hopefully will this year still. But oh, what was I saying? I saw two movies that like were basically micro budget movies that were still really good. And then, the first one we're going to talk about today, when we get to it, is definitely not micro budget. Like, it's very polished looking. It looks lower budget, but like doing a lot with that budget, I would say. And probably most of the ones we're talking about today are actually closer to that.
Mm-hmm.
But they did also have like a insanely huge budget French movie that I did not get to see, but I've heard is very good.
Yes, yeah, I saw reviews of it. I know which one you're talking about, the Count of Monte Cristo, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I wished I got around to being able to see that one too. The thing about the micro budget aspect is really interesting because usually in these bigger festivals like TIFF and things like that, we don't really get the micro budget films on that scale, not unless it's sort of like an auteur doing an experimental thing.
Hmm.
So if you want to catch micro budget films, you sort of have to catch them at really niche, small, regionalized film festivals, usually where it's local talent, things like that. But Fantasia is probably one of the biggest in the world that allows for such a wide range in budget, and you sort of never really know what you're going to get. I think of something like Skinamarink a couple of years ago, which was like a huge breakout hit from Fantasia, where I think that movie was made for only a couple grand, and it went on to becoming one of the biggest indie hits of the last couple of years, and one of the buzziest horror movies, whether or not you liked it or not, sort of thing. But yeah, Fantasia is a festival that allows those films to exist equally alongside like the first movie we're about to talk about, and sort of gives them equal opportunities.
Hmm. Yeah, I saw one of the movies I saw, which we're not talking about, but I do want to. Well, I'm going to highlight it here because now I've started talking, but I'll stop doing that. I saw Carnage for Christmas, which was like a very micro budget Australian movie from a friend of the from Alice Mayo Mackey, uh, a friend of Vera Drew, who did The People's Joker, and like this feels right at home with a lot of the stuff that I saw at Fantasia. But I remember The People's Joker being at TIFF a few years ago, and that felt like an outlier for TIFF. I'm
Mm-hmm.
very happy it was there, but it was not. It didn't feel like it felt like it was like strange in all of the in all the things that were there that year.
Yeah, and even People's Joker, despite the fact that it is very much an outsider film, still has quite a bit of significant star power behind it, with like Tim and Eric and those guys, that sort of comedy scene behind it.
True.
So it sort of makes it a bit of a really unique case. And I think TIFF booked that specifically because they knew it was going to become so newsworthy. I think they knew they had a good idea that it was going to get pulled. And create news, and look at that, and sure enough it did, and became one of the buzziest titles that didn't play but did play at the festival.
Hmm.
All right, well, we're here to talk about 5 movies that we saw. One we both saw, and then 2 each only one of us saw, and then we're probably going to list a couple honorable mentions as well. But we're going to start with the biggest one. We've already alluded to it twice now, and that is Cuckoo, which was directed by Tillman Singer.
How was your journey?
Very pleasant, thank you.
Good.
Gretchen, come say hi.
What's up?
I'm your neighbor. Haven't heard about you.
Why would you have heard about me?
How would you like to come work for me at the resort?
This happens sometimes.
You look like you don't belong here.
Why is there nobody working the reception after 10?
I want you to lock the doors and wait for me. I will come pick you up right now.
And this is a new neon horror film that's actually out now in theaters. You can go see this. So a lot of these movies, we're going to try to be a little bit vague and things like that. This one, we're probably going to be able to talk about it a little bit more in depth, and maybe we're not going to completely spoil it, but we're probably going to be able to talk about some aspects that might be considered spoilery. Just because I have a feeling that if you're interested in horror, you probably have already seen this. This movie will have been out for 2 weeks by the time this episode has come out, so you've probably had a chance to see it. It might even be leaving theaters, unfortunately, given the way theatrical windows exist nowadays. But this is a movie about a young girl a teenage girl who moves to Germany with her father and stepmother and stepsister, and weird things start happening, and she starts being sort of chased and followed, and we're not really sure what's going on or why her family moved there, all this sort of stuff. But this is going to be a very interesting conversation because I feel like you and I are basically on polar opposite ends of the spectrum as far as how much we like this movie. So because you like this movie significantly more than I do, I'd love to hear your thoughts first because I want to hear you sing its praises.
Oh, I mean, I really loved this movie. I think that I don't know how to talk about this movie without spoiling it. Around halfway through, it becomes like when this movie plays its hand, it's so wild. It's like I could not possibly have expected where it was going, and I think that it really like digs into its themes really in really interesting ways. And the themes are I was actually just talking to a friend of mine who just saw it in theaters, and the trailer really obfuscates. She was saying the trailer really obfuscates what this movie is about. And I think that's true, but not really in a lying way. It's just like until about halfway through, it's not quite clear what's going on. But then as soon as it clicks, I think this movie gets really, really good. I think it's good before that. I think that this has some of the best, probably the best performance I've seen from Dan Stevens as the main villain. He's actually terrifying in this, and I really love that for whatever reason, he's just started taking on German-speaking roles. He's an Englishman who learned German for a movie a few years ago called I'm Your Man, and now he's just back in a German movie again, speaking German. I mean, and speaking English with a very good German accent. But he's actually terrifying in this. And then Hunter Schafer, this is probably the biggest role I've seen Hunter Schafer in so far, because I have not watched Euphoria, where she's a main cast member. But this is a really good sort of proof of what she can do in a leading role. This is, I think that she was, honestly, I think if anything, she's like hindered a little bit by the fact that she's sort of this movie's final girl, which I personally think is inherently a less interesting role than the villain a lot of times. And but she's very good in it. She really brings up the people around her. Dan Stevens is even better than that and brings up the people around him even more. They have great on-screen chemistry. Dan Stevens has some fantastic monologues in this. That's sort of what I can say without getting really deep into the spoilery themes. Although I don't know, maybe once you've said your piece, we might have some stuff to talk about.
Yeah, I think I sort of agree with what your friend said about the trailer, because watching this trailer, I thought this movie was going to be a whole lot more terrifying than it actually was. That was probably one of the scariest trailers I've watched in the last few years, where to the point where I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to watch this movie. And it wasn't until the screeners became available to us that I was like, well, I can't ignore, you know, possibly the biggest movie playing at this festival and one of the bigger screeners I've had access to. So I decided to watch it. And I was sort of let down in terms of the actual scares. There's a couple really interesting moments, one of which is unfortunately spoiled in the trailer, and that's when she's being chased on the bike, which I think is a phenomenally beautiful shot of just watching shadows on the road and using passing lampposts to show shadows moving and things like that, and her being chased on while she's riding her bike. But, you know, I knew that scene was coming. As soon as she gets on the bike, I'm like, oh, okay, this is where she gets chased in the dark, which is always a bit frustrating, especially with horror movies when things are given away like that. It's like watching a comedy trailer and realizing all the best jokes are in the trailer, something like that. On top of that, like, I'll agree with a lot of the things you're saying. It's just I came to a different conclusion than that. I did think Dan Stevens was incredible. I think Dan Stevens is becoming one of the most interesting working actors these days. He's picking really interesting parts and absolutely elevating them with his charisma and talent in a way that, like, I can't even think of a comparable of someone else that's sort of doing the same type of elevation that he's been doing, and especially in a wide variety of genres. He's kind of doing a little bit of everything. I am sad that he didn't go farther. I wanted him to be bigger and crazier. And like, I get that you kind of need a progression and leading up to it. But I think, you know, that final act, he should have been absolutely losing his goddamn mind. And I don't think he got to that point enough. He was still good and interesting and scary, but like, I wanted him to go further with that. I'll agree with you about Hunter Schafer. I did think she was terrific. She has great chemistry with all of her scene partners, and she is hindered a little bit by the sort of final girl aspect and what that entails. But I think we get a really nice, touching moment with the way the movie ends. And I'm not going to reveal how it ends, but it involves the final escape and sort of a bit of a Mexican standoff situation that she is able to deftly navigate to come out alive. And I think she has a great moment with the other characters in this final sequence. But yeah, basically my biggest gripe with this movie is the science didn't science enough for me. And it's one of these types of movies where you either need to keep it all a mystery and explain nothing, or you need to really hammer it down and explain it. And I think you did a really good job in your review that you wrote for the website that I'm going to link to in the show notes, where you sort of help explain a bit more the backstory of why it's called Cuckoo and what that sort of means to this movie. Unfortunately, while I really found it very interesting, I learned a lot more from your review, I don't think there's still enough information in this movie to explain the why and the how aspect of this.
I don't know. The why and the how, I mean, this is partially just me. The why and the how is usually not a part of the movie that bothers me. I thought that the way the science shook out, I don't know. It's a movie, so I just expect it to be nonsense anyway. So you know, it was slightly better than nonsense, so that's good. But like, I was just looking for that thematic consistency, and I think that thematically, the sort of sci-fi element they end up going with is a really interesting way to sort of explore what this movie is all about, and sort of I really think that this movie is sort of about power imbalances, and I'm saying that as broadly as I can. But I think that the power imbalances that it shows here work like the sci-fi metaphor they use, the sci-fi device, is a really interesting way of showing that I haven't really seen. Maybe in like, I haven't really seen anything quite like it outside of maybe like Alien. And like, Alien goes in a completely different direction, obviously. But like, that's sort of that's like almost a similar sci-fi device.
Yeah, and I think you do a really great job sort of breaking down the themes in your review, which like I really love your review that you wrote. I think it's one of the best ones you've ever written.
Oh,
And
thank
that's
you.
saying something because I always love reading your reviews. So if you have watched this movie, I really do implore you to read it. And it's one of those. I'll say this: one of those reviews where like I didn't care for the movie, but I appreciated what you had to say about it. That it made me sort of appreciate your review even more because I didn't like the movie.
Well, that is extremely high praise. Thank you.
Like, I think a bit of a wasted opportunity is there's this bit of a plot where, you know, Hunter Schafer's character is, very confused, doesn't know what's going on, and then she gets introduced to a character who supposedly is an undercover police agent or something like that, and he's investigating what's going on. And right as soon as that sort of starts to get interesting, that character gets taken away from us in a way that sort of removes that from the storyline, and it just sort of halts this idea of explaining what was going on or why it was happening and all that sort of stuff that really just made me yearn for more of that.
That character played by Jan Bluthart, I think it's maybe a little unfortunate that I think I agree with what you're saying is what I'm trying to say. It's a
Mhm.
little unfortunate that that character isn't given just a little bit more to do,
Mhm.
because Jan Bluthart, first off, it's an amazing performance from Jan Bluthart. He's great in the role, but around in the final act, he mostly works to kind of supplement Dan Stevens' character with what you were saying you were missing earlier, in my
Yes.
opinion. And I think that that interplay works really well, and it especially works really well for like the choreography of that final Mexican standoff that they end up with at the end, like choreography, and also like choreography in I don't know that that's the right word, but like in terms of the writing, like the way that that Mexican standoff works kind of requires Jan Bluthart and Dan Stevens' performances to be exactly what they are at that point. But because they sort of end up being not quite extensions of the same character, but just sort of versions of the same idea, it robs just a little bit from a maybe different approach that they could have taken to really nail one or both of those characters.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way of putting it, and something that I would have wanted more of. And it's one of those things where like we clearly saw the same movie. It's just I felt slightly different in the execution of it, whereas it worked for you. I want a bit more answers, and you were satisfied with the answers that were given. And so, in that sense, it's not like we're like I'm reading a review and being like, "What the hell movie did Jeff watch? That's not what I saw at all." Which sometimes I'll read reviews like that where I'm just like, "I don't know where you got any of this information. This is not the same movie I watched."
Right. Yeah. Oh man, I'm very happy we're talking about this movie on this podcast, but I am a little sad. We do have to be fair. Well, we're both trying to be very vague, and I
Mm-hmm.
think we should be. But like, what I want to point out is like, honestly, if this movie looks like a movie that might be interesting to you, it is. Go and watch it. And even if it doesn't, like, if you're interested in horror movies, I really liked this. I tried to be as spoiler free as I could in my review, so please read the review. And if it sounds interesting, go watch this movie. Like, I think that if you have the opportunity to watch this, this was, I don't really know what I was expecting. I know this movie because it has been getting buzz. I didn't really go in with any expectations other than, oh, this is probably the biggest movie playing at the festival. I wonder if it's any good. And I was blown away by this. And even from listening to you, while it's very clear that you did not have the same reaction, it still sounds, and please correct me if I'm wrong, like you would probably recommend this movie more or less if people have the opportunity to see it.
Yes, I would recommend it, for sort of three reasons. One, Hunter Schafer is great, and it's great seeing her being able to transition from TV to film roles, and I want to see more of her in film. I haven't seen Kinds of Kindness yet. Apparently, she has a very small part in that, but it looks like she's got lots of stuff lined up in the next few years. Everyone wants to work with her, so I'm very excited to see what she does next. Two, if you like Dan Stevens, you're really going to like this performance because he's Dan Stevens and he seems to be on such a roll lately, just crushing every performance. And three, the look of this film is really unique, and I think they do a great job, especially since a lot of the horror seems to take place in the daylight, or at least in well-lit places, which there is nothing more frustrating than watching a horror movie where you're like, cool, stuff's happening in the shadows. I have no idea what the monster, creature, villain looks like or what's happening because everything is in the dark. And this is not one of those movies.
And the few times that things do take place in the dark, they are, I mean, they're still, as you said, well lit. Like there's that scene where she's riding home at night, and it specifically uses that darkness as a like visual device. So this is just a really well shot film. The cinematographer was Paul Fultz.
Well, good job, Paul. I enjoyed your work. All right. Well, yeah, I think we can't really say any more about this movie without fully getting into spoilers. But sure enough, I think if you're a fan of modern horror, this is probably one of your most anticipated movies of the year, and I think you will have seen it hopefully in the next few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm going to talk about my first movie that I saw on my own, and that's a movie called The Silent Planet, which was directed by Jeffrey St. Jules. And this is a movie about a man who, this takes place in the future, where whatever crime he had committed, his punishment is solitary confinement on a planet by himself, where he is forced to do hard labor there. So he is literally alone in the world. And so he is doing his work, which is some sort of mining, and he, transports it, and he doesn't see anyone, doesn't have contact with anyone. He lives on his own, and that is his punishment for the rest of his life. And then he manages to trick his computer monitors that he has died by removing a sensor from his body, and they'll go, oh, all right, well, this planet is now empty and it's ready for another prisoner. So a new prisoner arrives, and she shows up, and he's sort of excited that there's someone new there that he can maybe finally talk to, because he's been on this planet, I think, for a dozen years or so. And then we start to realize that maybe it's not such an accident that the two of them ended up on the same planet together. And you have to start to put the pieces together of, are they connected? Do they share this history? What is going on? All that sort of interesting stuff. And this is a very interesting movie because, it takes place in this very beautiful, mountainous, quiet area, but it's a bit of a sci-fi film because we learn that there are aliens on Earth, and it's sort of this allegory for illegal immigration because these aliens come to Earth because their home planet is no longer habitable, and humans don't like them there, and so they start killing them. But this woman who becomes this other prisoner was adopted by these aliens and realizes that they're peaceful, they mean no harm, they just need a place for them to live as a society. And so she becomes radicalized by her family being killed, and I believe her crime is treason or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the wording was, where it's she tries to attack the government, basically, and so she gets arrested. She gets before she has a chance to do it, she is sold out by a friend who is an undercover agent, and she gets arrested and sentenced to solitary confinement on a planet. And then the question is, did the guy that was already there, was he involved with killing her alien family? So this movie basically is a two-hander where it's Elias Koteas, who is a fantastic Canadian actor. I believe he's Canadian. Oh yeah, he's from Montreal, where he's one of those guys where you've definitely seen him in a bunch of things. He's been around for, 30 plus years. You see his face and you go, oh, okay, I recognize that guy, but you might not know his name or be able to sort of name his biggest roles, but he's been in a million movies and a million TV shows. He's just always been around. And then the female character is, her name is Brianna Middleton, which I'm not totally familiar with her work. I don't think I've ever seen her in anything else, but she is a bit of a newer rising actor. But yeah, I love watching Canadian films, so this was one that I was very interested in, and I like the sort of soft sci-fi angle as in this, and becomes a great meditation on whether or not you can trust your memories, especially once you've been alone for over a decade, because your brain kind of goes to mush not talking to anyone, and that's sort of a key component where the main character becomes very much an unreliable narrator, both with what he says and what he writes in his diary and his actions himself. So it's a very interesting sort of small, soft sci-fi film.
You gave a lot of backstory there, and I guess my main question is how much of that I'm curious, like, how is that communicated in the movie? Like, is it just those two actors, and that backstory sort of becomes clear somehow, or they talk about it, or does this flashback? Are there more than two actors? My main question is, are there more than two actors?
Yes, there are more than two actors,
Okay.
and we do get some flashback sequences, more of the female character, because we need to prove that her story is reality, whereas that kind of creates the more unreliable narrator aspect, because we don't see much of the backstory of the Elias Codius character, so we don't know whether his version of events are true or not. So we do get a bit of an interesting sort of dynamic there in that regard, where we can verify what is real and what is not based on what we're shown. So we do get a little bit of that. Some of it does come out in dialogue and exposition and things like that. But yeah, so it's a little bit of both, to answer your question.
Okay. Yeah, this is one that I got very busy during the last week of the festival. I think this is one that I briefly had maybe the opportunity to watch, and I didn't. So hopefully it's one that comes out soon, because I'm interested. It looked the few screenshots I've seen from it, and like the little bit of footage I've seen from it, looks beautiful. This movie is. It looked like it was. Well, I mean, it's all taking place on one planet, but it looks like that planet is a very, very well shot planet.
Yeah, I'm looking at my review because I wrote about where it was filmed. I think it was in Newfoundland, if I'm remembering correctly. So like it's a very beautiful sort of mountainous scenery, and we don't see like a ton of the planet. We sort of just have to assume that the whole planet looks like this, but it looks absolutely stunning in what they do. I would sort of relate it, this movie, a kind of a cross up between District 9 in terms of its allegories of aliens being illegal immigrants, with a little bit of Moon, the Sam Rockwell film, in terms of like being alone with your thoughts and that warping your reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds really interesting. I
Yeah.
really hope that I do get I'm going to be watching for it. I hope I get the opportunity to see that. Especially, it's been a good year good couple of years for Newfoundland films. So I'm happy to see another one, or hear about another one that's also good.
Yeah, and as usual, I'm always trying to be an advocate for Canadian cinema, so definitely watch for Canadian cinema. I don't know, that's my go-to thing. But what movie do you want to talk about there, Jeff?
So the next one I want to talk about is it's not Canadian, but it is also very focused around an unreliable narrator. The movie I wanted to talk about is called The Tenants, which was directed by Yoon. I hope I am pronouncing this correctly. Yoon Eun-kyung.
너 요즘 애들 꿈이 뭔 줄 아냐? 어떻게든 하루빨리 여기 뜨는 거야. 그렇게 해서 나온 게 천장세 같은 거야. 너 천장세가 뭔지는 알지? 건물을 짓기 전부터 천장에 사람이 살 수 있는 공간을 만들어주면 세금 혜택을 준다라는 거야. 신용 불량으로 회생 불가능한 인간들을 구제해주겠다라는 거지.
우리 계약이 한다는 건 아시죠? 저는 우리 엄마랑 달라서 공정하고 상식적으로 처리하는 걸 지향하거든요.
It's a Korean movie about a man, probably around my age, late 20s, mid 20s, late 20s maybe. And he's getting close to a promotion at his industry job. I think his job, he works at a company that makes lab grown meat, but he like works on spreadsheets. So he doesn't even it's not 100% clear if he even knows that the company even creates a product, because the only way that we interact with that company is through a few labeled packages and him working on spreadsheets. But he works extremely long hours so that he can barely make rent, and his landlord is getting ready to evict him if he can't. He's getting ready to evict him unless he, I think he's upping the rent cost or going to evict him because he'd like to move in. So he wants to get him out of that apartment, which would leave this guy, out on the street and working long hours anyway. And he already can't pay for his apartment. He basically lives to work. Anyway, that's the world that this sort of comes in, and he is forced to sublet his bathroom to make extra money. So he's forced to sort of use a service called Wolwolse. Well, not a service, but utilize a thing called Wolwolse, where he sublets one room of his house to make up extra rent, and he gets this couple that one of them looks like an older man and and his wife looks like a child. I don't know if she actually is. She's just very short. And they're a little strange. They're a little they're sort of off-putting, and they don't really interact. They're nice enough, but like they have a very separate life, and they just sort of take over his bathroom. And over time, he starts to sort of as he continues to work really long hours and barely get any sleep, and now there's someone in his apartment that he doesn't know very well. He starts to like sort of go mad with that. He starts to sort of imagine things from insomnia over the as he starts working longer and longer hours trying to get that promotion. And it's basically about that. It's just sort of his slow descent into his slow declining mental state as he tries to exist in a world that really just requires people as bodies to do spreadsheet things and then go to sleep. There's a line in this that I have unfortunately forgotten too much to quote well, so I'm going to paraphrase it. But it's essentially it's essentially like the city needs people to exist. So there's this utopian other city that he'd really like to move to, and if he gets his promotion, his company will pay for him to move to that other city. But if everybody got that promotion, then the poor city wouldn't exist anymore because no one would be in the poor city. So there have to be poor people in the poor city where people are living to work and not doing much else. And it's about modern work culture and how much it sucks to look for apartments. So it's I think it's very relatable to most people around my age.
I gotta say, you talk about this movie, I still have no clue what this movie's about, but it sounds very interesting.
It's very weird. So I was looking at the description on Fantasia Festival to see how much of this I can read out, because their descriptions are very long. They're very good descriptions. They're just way too long. But it talks about it's a claustrophobic tale of alienation, societal pressures. It uses the word Kafkaesque, which I think is very apt. He's constantly just encountering things that he doesn't have any context for. At one point, he's getting very close to getting that promotion. He thinks it's going to happen, so he starts getting ready to sell his apartment, and so he goes to the people that live in his bathroom to get them to sign the paperwork so they can move out. And they can't do that because they've sublet the air ducts above the apartment. So they have to get that signature now too. And as it gets just sort of more absurd, as it gets sort of more absurd and more, tiny nooks and crannies of this society start to pop up, it's sort of is like, what falls through the cracks of society and what do those cracks look like?
Okay, yeah, I sort of understand what you're getting at. Did you find what genre element was this mostly touching on? Was this like more of a sort of like a sci-fi absurdist sort of thing, or was there like a bit of a thriller or horror aspect to it? Like what sort of genres was it touching on?
I would call it the closest. It would be. I would say it's like an absurdist horror movie.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think that the biggest thing that this movie really does well as it goes on is, he starts getting more and more nightmares, and as it goes on, not only do his nightmares get weirder as he learns that there's someone crawling up in his ceiling, and he just can never talk to that person, so he starts to imagine what else is in his apartment, and as that happens, this movie does a really good job. Yoon Kyung does a really good job of using his declining mental state to sort of turn him from a character in a movie to a very unreliable narrator. Like it is very possible at the end of this movie to read the ending of this movie as literally none of this happened and he wasn't even the character that we saw throughout the whole movie. I think it would. I mean, it would be spoilers, but it would also take a long time to explain how it gets there. But I think it gets there in a really interesting way. It really evolves to sort of make you question what you're even seeing, but in like a good way, not like what the hell am I watching? Like what the heck am I watching?
Okay, very very interesting. This is the type of movie that I feel like does great at Fantasia, but probably is not going to be seen anywhere else in Canada or North America, which is a bit of a shame. It might end up getting like a Blu-ray release on import label where you might be able to see it that way. But unfortunately, it just sort of feels like one of those movies that might just go under the radar over here.
Yeah, it was definitely a smaller budget one. I think it uses that budget really well, but it is clearly a smaller budget movie. It's all in black and white, which I think is an interesting artistic choice. It works as an artistic choice, but it also would be a lot cheaper to shoot it in black and white, I think. So it's probably just as much a budgeting choice. But yeah, this is one that I could. This is sort of what I was talking. This is probably the closest to what I was talking about at TIFF, where this is not really the kind of thing you might see there. This isn't very People's Joker-esque, but it is a lot closer to that kind of micro budget filmmaking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, cool. All right. Well, the next film that I want to talk about is a film called Electrophilia, which is an Argentinian film from Lucia Puenzo. And this is about a woman who gets struck by lightning and wakes up after being in a coma for 6 weeks and tries to put her life back together. So this movie was sold to me because in the description, it was talking about how it is like the Argentinian version of Crash, the David Cronenberg film, which is one of my all-time favorite Canadian films and probably my favorite Cronenberg film. And I was like, ooh, this sounds very interesting because, she gets struck by lightning and ends up finding another group of lightning survivors. And I was like, okay, I sort of see where the comparisons to Crash are, except for it kind of fell a little bit short. This is a movie that looks beautiful. They do a lot of great work with what I assume is CGI lightning due to the close proximity, and having to use it on screen means it's probably not actually there. And it all looks very realistic, and they do a great job with that. And the makeup effects on all of these people who have, what's it called again, where you get the scars from being struck by lightning. And I wrote it in my review, and I can't remember. Lichtenberg scarring, I think it's like that, or Lichtenberg figures. And it just sort of really falls short, but it's got like so many interesting ideas. There is a fantastic 5-star movie in this that unfortunately kind of gets bogged down with a lot of its side plots, that it ends up just kind of becoming like a 3-star, 3.5-star movie for me, which is a bit of a real shame because I think I liked it more for its potential than the actual final product. But basically, this is about a woman. She's a veterinarian that works on a dairy farm, and there's a thunderstorm going on, and a pregnant cow gets loose, and so she goes out to try to bring it back to the barns, and it turns out that the cow is in labor, so she has to help try to give birth. Help the cow give birth. And at this time, both the cow and herself get struck by lightning. They both end up surviving, but they both end up getting these Lichtenberg figure scars, which I still think I'm not saying the right name, but I can't scroll through my review and talk at the same time. So she wakes up after this coma, and immediately doctors are, wanting to give her pills and put her through different physical therapies and things like that. And she's sort of struggling with all of this. And when she's in recovery, a mysterious man comes to her and was like, "Hey, do you have floaties going on in your eyes?" And she's like, "Yeah, I do." And he's like, "Here, take this magnet, put it over your eyes whenever you're sort of feeling them, and they'll clear up." And so she does that, and it does end up working. And he's like, "Well, if you want to learn more, maybe you should come see me in my group." And that's kind of all the information we get at the time. Eventually, she's kind of disillusioned by the mainstream medical field and figures she wants to try some alternative medicine. So she goes and seeks out this group, and they do electroshock therapy to help them with their being electrocuted injuries, which sounds counterproductive, but basically the way they describe it is that when you get electrocuted, your internal wiring kind of all gets a little jumbled up and scrambled, and the only way to reset it is through mild shock therapy to sort of re-jolt your system and restart it back up to its default settings. And so they do this as a group, and they all hang out in quiet rooms where there's no electricity currents inside these rooms. They're all like sort of metal plated rooms and things like that. So it helps you sort of decompress from all the buzzing and noise that we as humans mostly are able to ignore, but maybe these victims aren't able to ignore. So it's a very interesting movie, and you kind of got these sides of her partner and her father are really trying to push her to go through this mainstream medical treatments that's not really working for her. Her dad especially seems to be a bit of a pill-pushing doctor himself, who maybe got her mother addicted to medication that may have caused her to kill herself. We're not totally sure. Versus this very mysterious man who has unorthodox treatment, and when we learn a little bit more, he had previously gotten a patient of his killed through a electrical experiment that he's basically conducting, where this is basically his experimental therapy. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff that kind of comes through, but unfortunately in the end doesn't really amount to much. Like, her husband or partner that we're not supposed to trust just kind of ends up actually trying to look out for her best interest and doesn't understand what she's doing. And that's sort of the end of that storyline. It's like, oh, okay, so he was a good guy. It wasn't like he was being nefarious at all. So that sort of stuff felt like they were building it up just to have no real climax for that situation. And she ends up starting an affair with this doctor and things like that. And also that sort of just fizzles out at the end as well. So it's very interesting. Lots of really great imagery and sequences and things like that, and great ideas that just don't unfortunately amount to a great conclusion for me.
So this movie did actually win a couple of awards at Fantasia.
It did.
And the one I'm most interested about, because you've definitely touched on it, but I think it's worth maybe going into a little more detail. What did you think of the performance of Mariana Di Girolamo who played Ada, who I'm going to assume is probably the main character, correct?
Yes, she is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought she was really good. You know, she does have this. A big part of this story is sort of overcoming her fears and being able to live a normal life after being electrocuted. Because when something like that happens, you know, everything you realize everything in our life is powered by electricity. How do you know that you're not going to go through the same experience again? And she's going through very, you know, debilitating physical pain post the incident. And so I think she does a great job of this nervous trepidation while also wanting to conquer her fears and sort of control, you know, her injuries and sort of get back to full health. And so we get some really interesting stuff at the right after her injury where she wakes up in the middle of the night terrified because everything is just making so much noise around her. And so she runs around her apartment unplugging literally everything, like her TV, the air conditioning, every lamp that she can find, the fridge, everything that was making any sort of sound of buzzing electricity, where you don't notice that it's there until you remove it. Like if you've ever been in a room where you suddenly start unplugging everything, you go, oh, it actually is a lot quieter now. So it's very interesting to sort of see that play out. And I think she does a great job with that. She's just sort of let down by the script, where I think a lot of these actors turn in really great performances are just sort of let down by a third act that doesn't really go anywhere.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Like we're expecting there to be this big climactic showdown between this doctor and either her partner or her father, and it just never comes. Like we see her partner trailing the doctor, and we're like, oh, okay, I know where this is going. They're going to have a confrontation, or maybe not directly together. It's just going to be a confrontation between Ada, or as she also is called, Amanda, and her partner, and none of that ends up happening. So that's why it just sort of, I mentioned where it just sort of fizzles out, where it goes, oh, you know, he really did just kind of have her best interest at heart, and he wasn't stalking her doctor. He was just trying to learn more about what was going on, but none of that's really communicated. So that's just the feeling you're left with. So I don't know if that was a plot line that was not finished or fleshed out enough, or they wanted you to feel paranoid when there was no reason to be paranoid. I don't know what the point of it was.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Like I said, it was compared to Crash, and yeah, there's a little bit element to that where you've got some people who, after being electrocuted, are, you know, way more interested in it and trying to harness it, like in Crash, where they're trying to harness their post-car crash feelings. But that's sort of where the similarities stop there. So yeah, it's a bit of a rough comparison that I don't really agree with.
Although your description of how the end of the movie made you feel does actually sound quite a bit like a lot of both positive and negative reviews that I've read of David Cronenberg's latest movie that premiered at Cannes, The Shrouds. So it might be interesting to like watch these two together and see, and you know, see if that if like a third act that ends up sort of not going anywhere, what the intentionality behind those, what the intentionality or lack of intentionality actually looks like later on in the year. I think that I don't know, that's something I'm setting for myself, but you have, despite your criticisms, you've made me fairly interested in this movie, and I'm interested to see, you know, this is another one that I almost had the opportunity to see but didn't get the chance to.
Yeah, this is a movie a bit like Cuckoo, where it didn't fully work for me, but it's one I want to talk out with someone who had seen it to sort of see, you know, did they feel the same things that I felt, or what did I miss that maybe they saw that that I'd be very curious to see. And that's why I think our discussion of Cuckoo is a very productive one, because even just reading your review felt a bit like a discussion. And I know we had messaged each other back and forth a bit after we had watched it, which really helped me. And this is one of those movies where I feel a discussion is warranted about it, because it does have some very interesting themes and some great imagery that I kind of want to unpack a bit more.
Well, I'm sorry I wasn't able to watch it, but when we get together for our episode on the Goyas, we can talk about this one because I'm going to assume that this will be nominated for lots of Goyas.
Well, do they include all Spanish language films? Because this is technically an Argentinian film, where the Goyas are just Spain, right?
I am not entirely certain, but I know that I know they do in some capacity. I don't know what that capacity is. Like, I don't know if this would be up in internationals or if this would be likely to be there or unlikely because it isn't a Spanish film. But I know that in the past there have been Argentinian Goya winners and Latin American Goya winners.
Interesting. I wonder, I've never really looked into the Goyas or any other region-specific awards very deeply outside of, the Oscars in Canada. But it would be very interesting if they had an award of Best Spanish Language Film Not from Spain, which would be kind of cool. But maybe they do that, and I'm just talking out of my ass.
Yeah, it's something I don't want to go into too many more details about before I look up what are probably very easy to find answers to these questions. But it would be interesting. I'm interested in more regional movie awards. Just there's only so much time.
That's the thing. Yeah, and I am too. And I would love to do, stuff on the Caesars or the Goyas or other countries that have awards. Or I know there is an Asian specific awards ceremony where they sort of take, all of East Asia and everyone is eligible. And so like looking up and seeing like Drive My Car dominate it the year that came out for the Asian awards. And I wish I knew what it was called off the top of my head, which I think is absolutely fascinating. But one, like you said, there's only so much time for us to cover things and watch things. And two, a lot of these more regional awards and festivals and things like that, it's really hard to get access to these movies. We're like, we covered the Canadian Screen Awards, and even that, outside of like the top 2 to 3 movies, it's really hard to access these films.
I think for the Césars, because you mentioned the Césars earlier, when those happened this year, I think I had seen 2 movies, and I might have had access to an additional 3 out of like the total of about 20 or 30 nominees.
Yeah, so like it's next to impossible to watch it all, and like the best you could do, like we do for the Canadian Screen Awards, is like try to watch all the Best Picture nominees, and you're like, well, that's about 60% of the nominations themselves, and that's about the best I could do.
Yeah, well, and then the Canadian Screen Awards has a lot of categories, some of which are basically exclusive. Like there'll just be one thing, there'll just be like 5 nominees, and they're all only in this one category.
Yeah.
But I do like that about the Canadian Screen Awards. I like being able to award lots of movies. It's just tough when you want to actually try and watch them all.
100%. All right. Well, what was the last movie that you want to talk about there, Jeff?
Well, the last movie I want to talk about is actually one that I kind of expect to see at the Canadian Screen Awards in one of the smaller categories, I think. But the way I'm going to talk about it is actually going to be fairly similar to what you said about Electrophilia. I watched the movie Darkest Miriam, which is about a library attendant in Toronto at the Allen Gardens branch, which is like, she's at the Toronto Public Library at the Allen Gardens branch, which is actually like 20 minutes from where I live. So I didn't know that going into this movie. And then when I saw Allen Gardens, I'm like, oh, I could go there. But anyway, Darkest Miriam is about a library attendant in Toronto who is kind of just stuck in life. And I think that's really what this movie is about in my reading, is it's just about being stuck. In this movie, very early on, she's sort of like, she knows all of the regulars of the library. And one thing this movie does really well at the beginning, she describes all the regulars as like they do various incidents, because she's always filing incident reports. So a lot of the early part of the movie is told through incident reports, and she's able to to sum up basically every one of her library regulars within like 1 or 2 sentences. So you get a lot of these bit characters who don't do very much, but are like very well defined, one-dimensional background players. But anyway, she's sort of in this, she's in this job where really all she does is file incident reports and look for anything exciting. And at one point, um, two different things happen. She starts receiving threatening letters, but not like directly to her. They just start kind of showing up in things that she's already doing. Like she'll be putting a book back on the shelf, and a threatening letter will come out that is clearly directed at her. But like, there's no way that anyone should have known that she was going to be putting that book on that shelf. And then she also meets a taxi driver who takes lunch at the same time as she does on the park bench across from her in Allen Gardens. So those two things happen, and this movie is like, it kind of tries to be half thriller and half romance between both of those, and it's interesting, but it never quite comes together in a way that fully worked for me. This movie, I think that the biggest thing that I got from uh, this movie is generally, a lot of the payoffs are very unsatisfying, which I didn't mind because I think that this movie, in my reading, is very much, as I said, about being stuck. It's about a person who is very stuck in her life and doesn't really know how to progress from where she is. She's a library attendant. She doesn't seem like she necessarily wants to stay a library attendant in the Toronto Public Library, living in a very small apartment that she doesn't like very much. But she also doesn't really seem to know what she does want to do outside of that. So, she'll go home and she'll be like, what am I doing at home? I mean, she doesn't say that, but she has, like, the first time we see her in her apartment, she walks in and immediately has a breakdown because there's just nothing to do. So I think for that reason, if this is really, a movie about being stuck, I think that a lot of the ways in which a lot of the payoffs are unsatisfying is actually pretty thematically relevant because, she keeps looking for things to happen and nothing interesting happens, which will, move her forward at all, other than this romance, which it's a very nice romance. The main actors have great chemistry with each other, and that also ends up sort of fizzling out at the end in a thematically relevant way. That's actually probably story-wise the most satisfying payoff of the movie, which is weird to say because it doesn't fizzle out in a good way. But yeah, that's sort of what this movie is. I think that the reason it didn't really come together for me at the end is I actually really like movies that sort of set something up and then intentionally let you down at the end by not giving you like a payoff that's really nice. They just sort of like don't pay off and make you think about what you maybe wanted to happen and how bad you feel about not getting it now. And so I really I like movies like that. And I think this movie mostly does that, except that it sort of gets like a tiny little happy ending at the end. It's not that happy, but it's like she gets like one small victory at the end that does not seem earned. But the whole movie sort of like the whole ending sort of revolves around it. And it kind of makes a lot of the things that had made me really interested and like thinking about what this movie is saying, it kind of like pushes them aside a little bit because at the end she can, smile about this little thing, this little victory that kind of comes out of nowhere. I'm being maybe more vague than I should be, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in this movie and very little of it actually goes anywhere, which is varying degrees of good.
Yeah, it does sound very interesting. And I do like the using the library angle because that could be a great metaphor for different things. I'm not familiar with the lead actress Britt Lower, but it does feature Soo-Kyin Lee and Jean Yoon, two pretty good actors in Canada. People probably know Jean Yoon from Kim's Convenience. She was the wife on that show. And Soo-Kyin Lee was a former Much Music VJ turned artist, sort of performance artist, and she's acted in a few things over the years. What did you think of the lead performance?
The lead performance was very good. Britt Lower is very good in this. She's very charismatic on screen, And like I said, she has extremely good chemistry with the romantic lead in this movie, Tom Mercier. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Who plays Yanko, who is a taxi driver, but he's also an abstract artist, and not like a notable abstract artist. He makes some very strange paintings in his free time sometimes, and that's just kind of what interests him. But this movie actually reminded me a little bit. I guess Britt Lower's performance as well reminded me a little bit of what was it called? Sometimes I Think About Dying with Daisy Ridley from Fantasia last year, actually. Because in that movie as well, Daisy Ridley plays this person who is so reserved because she doesn't think that there is anything interesting about her. And in this movie, Britt Lower as Miriam Gordon, she has like a different take on that same kind of emotion. She plays this character who she's traumatized by one or two things in her past that may or may not be like that bad if we want to compare miseries. Like, I don't think she has as hard a life as Yanko does, her romantic interest. But she doesn't like to talk about her past very much, and she doesn't really know what she wants to do or what could be interesting about her. So she has sort of that same kind of vibe about her, but she is more charismatic because she is in a people-facing role. I honestly, this is very similar, at least her performance is very similar to what Daisy Ridley's character in Sometimes I Think About Dying would have to be if she was in a customer-facing role.
Interesting. Yeah, that was a movie that I really liked, and I know not a lot of people were too crazy for. I think because it was so subdued, but I really liked it, and I thought it was nice to see her outside of the Star Wars character. So that you comparing it to that does sound favorable to me, and one that kind of makes me want to check it out now.
And I do mean that as a good thing, because Sometimes I Think About Dying was like that was maybe my favorite movie of last year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I can't remember if it ended up at number 1 on my list, but it was in the top 5, and I talked about it. I talked about it on our year in review last year as well.
Oh, right. Yeah. I forgot about that. I think it was a movie that for the longest time it was in my top 10, but by the time the end of the year, it just fell out. So I think it was like my number 11 or number 12 movie. Yeah.
And this is one that I wrote a capsule review for the site for this one. And I was actually very happy that the person that gave me access to the screener said to save the longer review for the theatrical release later this year. And I was very happy they did that, because this is one that like I said, it didn't fully come together for me, but I also have been thinking about it since then. And I really like to try and watch it 1 or 2 more times if I get the opportunity, because it's one of those that, like, it does stick with you, and like I'm not entirely sure if the things that didn't quite resonate with me on the first viewing. I don't know if they were actually bad. Like, I want to go back and see, does a second viewing improve it? And so this is one that I think is very interesting. There's a reason I wanted to talk about it here. There are other movies that I saw at Fantasia that I am not talking about, but I really did want to touch on this one, even though I've been, critical of it, but still.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, I would love to hear your thoughts on it if you end up watching it again. So very interested to hear that. All right, that is 5 movies that we both saw, and then we're going to do a couple honorable mentions if we have any honorable mentions. I watched a movie called Hollywood 90028.
This is the timely suspense story of the year, filmed in the most sex-oriented locale in the world, Hollywood 90028. This is the story of the thousands of pretty young girls who come to Hollywood to find stardom and find instead they have to survive any way they can. Hollywood 90028 is the address where you'll find countless girls doing things they never thought they would do and meeting people they never dreamed of meeting, not even in their wildest nightmares. Hollywood 90028, the sex and sun capital of the world, becomes the setting for one of the most bizarre stories in years when a man who cannot control his strange desires goes hunting in Hollywood for ways to satisfy them.
And this was actually a part of Fantasia. They love to screen older films, especially ones that are getting restorations. And this is a movie that came out in 1974 and was just announced that is getting a 4K restoration. That's what the screening was. And I'm trying to remember. I can't remember who is the company. It's a company called Grindhouse, which is a boutique label that puts out physical media, and they're distributing this. And this is a movie that is sort of getting a lot of great rave reviews as far as turning the exploitation genre on its head a little bit, because it was written and directed by a woman. And the movie was compared to Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, which was a very early proto slasher film that sort of inspired a lot of movies along the way. This is about a man who wants to work in Hollywood as a cinematographer, but can't seem to get work, and the only work that he gets is filming these like cheap porno reels that are like used for like coin operated machines in adult movie stores sort of thing, or adult theaters. And he takes out his rage by killing women, by strangling them. But it's got this very interesting exploration of loneliness and what it means to be in a city that will, suck you dry for everything that's your worth, and, force you to do things for money that you don't want to do, both the main character and also the women who end up appearing in these porno films, so to speak. So it's a very interesting sort of exploitation-y, sort of thrillery, but more of a meditation on what it's like to not really have a purpose in life after you've had dreams and aspirations. So I'm very excited to see this get a physical release. And I know I saw when it was announced that it was getting a release, a bunch of people were like, oh man, I'm excited to see this, or I've seen this before in really grainy version, so I'm excited to see it restored. So I think this is going to be a bit of a buzzy title in terms of the boutique world, which I know I've recently started to dip my toes into, and those people are nuts about some of the obscure movies that you will literally never hear about.
There was I just recently went to the Review Cinema here for the first time, and they do a lot of screenings of those, which I really wish the Review Cinema didn't take me a half an hour to get to, because I would go to so many of those. They screen so many movies that, as you were saying, I'd never heard about. And I'm sure that I'll have to actually watch to see if that one gets screened there, because it would be right up their alley.
Yeah, it was a very fascinating one, and has a fantastically shocking final image that it definitely is going to sort of live in my head rent-free for a very long time. And because it takes place in 1974, that's when it was shot, you get a look at Hollywood at that time, kind of like when you watch something like Taxi Driver or Midnight Cowboy set in the same era in New York, and you realize just how grimy and gross of a city it was back then before it got cleaned up and gentrified. And this sort of does a very similar thing for LA.
Cool. Yeah, I actually I recently watched Hardcore, which was from around the same time. Maybe that's the 80s, but like that was in LA as well, and it looks, it does not look like LA today. I'm just comparing this to other movies because I haven't seen this one, but I'm very interested in this.
Yeah, I think you get a kick out of it, and it would be one I'd be curious to have a conversation with you about if you end up watching it.
Well, I will let you know.
Yeah. Do you have any honorable mentions there, Jeff?
I do. Possibly my favorite, or not favorite, possibly my most anticipated movie going into Fantasia is one that I was not able to get a screener for, but which did thankfully just release in theaters right before we recorded this. So I have now seen it. Twilight of the Warriors, Walled In. This is a epic like martial arts crime movie from Hong Kong that's when I say epic, it's like huge in scope. It's all about the Kowloon walled city that used to exist in Hong Kong. I think it was torn down in, I want to say, 2014. And it's sort of it's a really bittersweet portrait of life in Kowloon walled city dressed up in a gang war. Um, and it's basically about there's a refugee named, I forget his first name, I forget his given name. His last name is Chan. There's a refugee named Chan who ends up in Kowloon walled city because he's running from some people that he owes money to after he buys a fake ID and it looks really, really fake. So he's running away from these guys, the leader of whom is named Mr. Big, and he ends up in Kowloon walled city, where for whatever reason the guy who is in charge of who runs the gang that runs the city, he finds Cyclone, played by Louis Koo, who is the gang leader in charge of all of Kowloon walled city, who takes a liking to him for some reason. It's the reason that I think is most obvious, I don't even think is the actual reason that he takes a liking to him. I think he's just like impressed with his gumption of coming in, and he comes in with a bag that he thought had a lot of money in it. It actually has cocaine. So he just runs in and tries to start selling cocaine in gang territory, which, originally it doesn't go over well with the gang members, but Cyclone, for whatever reason, really takes to this guy's gumption. So he sort of goes under this guy's wing and becomes an enforcer for the gang in the walled city. And then he gets pulled into a war between three gangs over who should control the walled city. And it sort of, it kind of becomes about the relationship between these three these three older gang lords who have had this sort of uneventful peace for about 20 years following a very, very brutal open gang war in the 60s. The very beginning of the movie says these three people basically killed each other. And then it goes into the movie, and I'm like, wow, what a way to start off a movie. I actually thought for the longest time that it was starting by telling us the plot of the movie, and it was then going to dramatize the whole thing, which it did not do. That is like backstory to this movie. But that's what I say when I'm talking about this being epic in scope. It's really about these three older people dealing with the past, and this one guy who ends up in the middle of that and sort of brings them all back together and sort of breaks that peace. And it is directed by Soi Chiang, who I'm hoping I'm pronouncing right, who gets a lot out of that. I thought this was going to be like wall-to-wall action, and it has lots of action scenes. It's very much a martial arts movie, but it's he really milks the drama for it. Like Louis Koo as Cyclone is an incredible performance, and I think he fights like in two scenes. He doesn't have to fight very much. When he does, they're great fights, but most of the time it's just him. It's just sort of him reminiscing about the old days, and it is fascinating to watch. He is such a charismatic performer. Chan Lok Kwan is the name of the main character, played by Raymond Lam, who unfortunately is he's not as interesting as the other characters because he's sort of a blank slate character to exist between these three very defined gang lords. But he does put in a really good performance, and he's where a lot of the bittersweetness of this movie comes from, because with the walled city no longer existing, like this is a real place that existed and no longer does. This movie is very much it's got a very sentimental undertone of this place it was basically the projects, but it was our home and we really liked it. And the last scene of the movie is them sort of all looking out at the sunset from the walled city as it's about to be destroyed. So it's a very sentimental movie that also has a lot of really good action. and starts with an absolute zinger of a backstory, which I was happy to learn, or at least interested to learn. This is the first of 3 movies, and the movies are going in reverse chronological order. I think that's a very interesting choice, especially considering the gang lords in this are played mostly by, well, older actors. So I don't know. And even in the flashbacks, they're played by the older actors. So I don't know how they want to go back 20 years and then another 20 years and what that's going to look like. But I'm very interested to see, to learn more about Kowloon Walled City. It was not a thing I'd known about before. And granted, now my all my info about it comes from a martial arts movie that is a martial arts movie, but like it's an interesting place. I think the only thing that didn't quite work for me is this movie is very, very grounded for most of it. I mean, it's very grounded, but with like the typical suspension of disbelief you would reserve for a martial arts movie. People go flying when they get punched, for example. But right at the very end, with like one character, it introduces just like one supernatural element that, in my opinion, tonally clashes with the entire vibe they've been going for. And it ultimately works because introducing that allows them to sort of bring in very very on the nose metaphors into like how they stage each of those scenes, how they stage a lot of the action scenes. But it is very weird to go from a over the top, but like very over the top but still sort of realistic martial arts movie, over the top in the way of like a Jackie Chan movie, to something that is at the very end like very lightly a monster movie.
Yeah, this was a one that did catch my eye when looking through the titles, but didn't end up getting the chance to see. But I'm glad you saw it and can recommend it so much.
Yeah, I think this is one that friend of the show Rachel would really like, because it's got a lot of great Hong Kong actors, and also it's just an awesome action movie. And it is one that I would recommend going to see in theaters. I was very happy that my local theater did have this one. And it premiered at Cannes. It was a midnight selection at Cannes, which where it did pretty well. I don't think it won anything, but I also don't know what the midnight awards at Cannes look like. Those are just not ones that are publicized in the places that I usually look.
Interesting. Well, thank you for talking about that. I think this is a great place to sort of wrap up our coverage on the Fantasia Film Festival. Jeff, thank you once again so much for coming on the show and sharing all of your great insights. I'm going to link to the reviews that you wrote, including movies that we didn't even talk about today, along with the reviews that I wrote as well, too, in the show notes. But where can people find more of your work, and what do you have going on with your podcast there?
Well, as you said, I've got a podcast, so you can find that podcast on Spotify. We are Classic Movies Live, where we talk about movies that just came out. Our most recent episode, as of this recording, is on the movie Thelma, starring June Squibb. That was actually that was a very good episode. We talk a lot about. Obviously, neither me nor Pierre is a senior citizen, but we do talk a little bit about representation of senior citizens in film, and we, for whatever reason, ended up having an interesting conversation about 4DX in Thelma, even though that's not a movie in 4DX. So that's a fun episode. And also, by the time this episode comes out, by the time this episode that we're recording right now comes out, I believe our 5th episode of a series we're doing called Director Showdown should be out. I think it's our 5th. It might just be I think it's our 5th or our 4th. Anyway,
I think it's your 4th.
Our 4th then.
Yeah.
It is going to be, well, I can spoil it because it won't be a spoiler by the time this comes out. We're talking about Darren Aronofsky and Sarah Polley, which is a very interesting pairing, and one that Well, one that the movies I picked, I thought were a very good pairing, and now I'm not second guessing that. But if those movies were not what I expected them to be, so I'm sure it was a very interesting discussion. We got a guest on for that one, so I'm excited. He's a very big fan of one of the movies that we picked. So
Nice. Well, I'm looking forward to listening to that. I am a ardent listener of your show, so and I've been loving this series that you've been doing.
I really hope that we can sort of get into the groove of doing them. I don't want to say exactly what kind of timeline, but I hope we can get into the groove of doing them regularly, because I want to be done with it, but I don't say that meaning like I want it to end. I really like doing this series, and I want to get through round one. And round one is probably like 30 episodes. So, I'm really excited doing these, and I really hope that this is one that I think there's a lot of potential in this series, and I'm always really happy to talk about the movies. And I think that so far our episodes have been very good. So I do recommend checking them out. We've got some interesting matchups that you can already sort of like see coming in round two.
Well, I'm a big fan of it, and I will link to your show and everything else that you have done and where to find you in the show notes. But yes, thank you again, Jeff, for coming on. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. I always love doing these, and I've now been on way more than I ever thought I would. So,
well, I'm gonna keep inviting you if you keep saying yes.
Well, all right. So you'll hear me again.
Very soon, because we got TIFF coming up, and you're going to be doing TIFF coverage with me, so this will not be the last time.
Yeah, well, it's one more time before the summer's out.
Well, this has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at ContraZoomPod. Did you see anything at Fantasia this year? Send an email to ContraZoomPod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music, and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.